It was a crisp winter morning, and the small bakery in the heart of the city was bustling with activity. Customers shuffled in and out, clutching steaming cups of coffee and paper bags filled with fresh pastries. The air was rich with the warm, comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and sugary treats. Behind the counter, Robert the baker diligently arranged the baked goods, greeting customers with his usual efficiency. In his early 50s, with streaks of gray in his hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, Robert had run this bakery with passion for decades, though the weight of the daily grind was beginning to show. The doorbell jingled, pulling Robert's attention away from the counter. A man in tattered clothes stepped inside, his weathered coat and shoes, so worn that his toes peeked through the holes, immediately set him apart from the rest of the clientele. The cold had reddened his face, and his shoulders sagged as though carrying the weight of the world. The other patrons cast fleeting glances his way, quickly averting their eyes. Robert looked him over, his brows furrowing. "What can I do for you?" he asked curtly. The man fumbled with trembling hands, pulling out a few coins. "Can I buy a loaf of bread?" he asked in a soft, almost pleading voice. Robert stood tall behind the counter, his tone unyielding. "Do you have enough money for it?" he asked, his words tinged with mockery. The man opened his hand, showing a few small coins. "This is all I have. If it's not enough, perhaps you could spare a small discount?" Robert shook his head firmly. "Sorry, this isn't a charity," he said coldly. "The price is the price. If you can't pay, you'll have to go elsewhere." The man's face fell. Without another word, he slipped the coins back into his pocket and shuffled out into the biting cold. The moment he stepped outside, the wind hit his face like a wall, making him pull his thin coat tighter around his frail body. One of the bakery's customers approached Robert. "Don't you think that was a bit harsh?" she asked. Robert shrugged. "If I gave bread to everyone who couldn't pay, I'd have to shut this place down," he replied. "I can't stand people who expect handouts." That night, as Robert locked up, his mind wandered back to the man. Why had the encounter unsettled him so much? He had dealt with countless situations like this before, yet there was something different about that man. The sadness in his eyes, the quiet resignation in his demeanor. But Robert quickly dismissed the thoughts and headed home. The next morning, on his way to the bakery, Robert spotted the man again, sitting on a street corner. He was huddled under a thin blanket, the cold clearly taking its toll. Robert stopped in his tracks, observing him more closely this time. The man's face was etched with lines that spoke of hardship, but something else caught Robert's eye. A small military medal hanging from a frayed cord around his neck. It was a symbol of service, one that stirred a distant memory. All morning, Robert couldn't shake the image of the man. That medal reminded him of a firefighter he had met long ago, but he couldn't quite place the connection. The thought nagged at him, and by the afternoon, he decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. Closing the bakery early, Robert set out to find the man again. When he reached the corner, the man was still there. Robert hesitated, then approached. "Excuse me," he began. "You were here yesterday, and I wasn't kind to you. I'm sorry." The man looked up, his eyes showing a flicker of surprise before softening into a small smile. "It's all right," he said. "Everyone has their struggles." As Robert studied his face more closely, recognition began to dawn. "Do I know you?" he asked. The man shook his head gently. "You probably don't remember me," he said. "But I once helped you. You might have forgotten, but I never did." Robert's brow furrowed. "Help me? When?" The man's gaze grew distant. "You were just a young man. There was a car accident. You were trapped inside, and I pulled you out. I was a firefighter then. After that, life went on. But I've never forgotten that day." Robert stood in stunned silence, his memory racing back to the accident that had almost claimed his life. He remembered the firefighter who had saved him, and suddenly, the man's face became clear. "It's you," Robert whispered, his voice catching. "You saved my life." The man nodded, his smile faint but genuine. "Yes," he said, "but that was my job. You don't owe me anything for it." Robert felt a lump in his throat. "I never even thanked you," he said, his voice trembling. "And yesterday, I didn't even give you a loaf of bread. I'm so sorry." The man shrugged. "That day, It was my turn to help you. Yesterday, it wasn't yours to help me. But today, maybe it is." Without a word, Robert turned and hurried back to the bakery. He prepared a bag filled with bread, pastries, and a steaming cup of coffee. Returning to the man, he handed it over with a determined look. "This is just the beginning," he said. "I owe you so much more." From that day on, Robert's life began to change. He and the man, whose name he learned was William, developed a close bond. Robert helped William find shelter and work, sharing his story with his customers. Moved by the tale, many of them stepped forward to offer help. Some provided job opportunities, while others contributed to William's living expenses. One day, William showed Robert an old photograph of a young firefighter pulling a man from a wrecked car. "That's you," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. William nodded. "That was just a part of my duty," he said. "But the kindness you've shown me now means far more." Robert, deeply moved, shared the story with everyone who walked through his bakery doors. Over time, the bakery became more than a place to buy bread. It turned into a community hub where people came together to share and support one another. Inspired by William's resilience and humility, Robert placed a sign outside the bakery: "Life rises with kindness." Every morning, as he watched the sun rise through the bakery window, Robert remembered the day William had saved his life. That memory was a constant reminder of the power of gratitude, compassion, and second chances. Sometimes, the greatest hero in someone's life isn't who they expect. It's the person they meet when they need it most. Enjoyed the story? Don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend. Hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Let's spread the inspiration together.